It's about two things. It's about recognition, for the very first time, recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the first peoples of our continent, and recognising their 65,000 years of continuous occupation of our continent. That's an extraordinary thing. It's rightly referred to as the oldest living cultures in the world. And it's about listening. And what we have in the voice is the request from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to other Australians that that's the way in which they wished to be recognised. Like Canada, we've also been talking about reconciliation for a long time. That's become a request for recognition in the Constitution, but the form of the recognition is what was asked for by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples themselves after a number of conventions, and it will be a voice that will speak to the Parliament and the government about matters concerning Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. We think it's a very, very good change for Australia and will make us a more unified and a better country.
Could you talk to us a bit about how that would work? Give some context examples as to how that voice might be applied in decision making in Australia.
Because the voice will be in the Constitution, it won't be able to be legislated away. We've had some difficulties in the past with various representative bodies for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people that have simply been abolished by incoming governments. That won't be able to happen. It'll be in the Constitution. And we expect that the voice will speak to Parliament and speak to government about matters that are of the most importance, things like health, education, housing and justice. Those are the big policy areas where Aboriginal people in Australia are far behind other Australians in health outcomes, far behind in life expectancy, much worse justice outcomes with a very, very high level of incarceration. All of those matters, we think we can get better policy and better laws if we listen to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are affected by those laws and policies.
What's been the reaction to that? Has there been much pushback? Has there been an embrace of this change or this potential change?
There's been an embrace from some Australians, but this is a political process. We have to have a voice. We have to have a constitutional referendum later this year. First of all, it has to pass through both houses of Parliament. That's happened with an absolute majority. That's happened. And later this year we'll have a referendum at which all Australians will vote. We need to get a double majority, which means a majority of all Australian voters and in a majority of our states, so 4 out of the 6 states. The reaction has been one where part of the Australian Parliament has decided to oppose this change. That's a matter of regret to my party, which forms the government in Australia. We had hoped that there would be bipartisan agreement on this because the record of referendums in Australia is a difficult one and generally they succeed when there's bipartisan agreement. We didn't get that, but I am still confident that this referendum will succeed.
So how does engagement with Canada affect that debate in Australia? Does that engagement help with an amendment like this?
It's more that we can look at a very long history of engagement here in Canada, a different constitutional position for Indigenous people here in Canada, a different history of engagement between government and Canadian Indigenous people. I think that's of interest. I sometimes think that Canada's a long way ahead of Australia in the way in which the Canadian government, the national government, has engaged. I don't think that the Canadian experience is going to be a big part in the political debate in Australia. Mm-hmm. It's more for people that study these things or look at experiences overseas that is a matter of interest. But in Australia, the debate is going to be very much a domestic debate. It's going to be one which looks at our history, looks at why we should have recognition, and recognises that we will do better if we are listening to the people who are affected by laws and policies.
When we speak about examples of countries with which we share common goals in history, certainly one issue that Canada is dealing with right now is foreign interference vis-a-vis China. It is something that Australia is ahead of the game in terms of Canada, having dealt with it several years back. Are there any lessons from Australia that Canada might learn?
I'm not going to say what Canada could or should learn. I can talk about the Australian experience, which is that we, with bipartisan agreement, my party was in opposition in 2018. The government introduced legislation to create criminal offences of foreign interference, and they became law in 2018, and they continue to be supported by both sides of Australian politics. Mm-hmm. At the same time, we introduced a foreign influence transparency scheme, which is intended not to create a criminalised environment, but to create greater visibility when anyone is acting in Australian government or in Australian politics on behalf of a foreign country. We want to know about it, which is why the name of the scheme is a transparency scheme, and that's now been in operation for some 4 years.
Mm-hmm. Well, I will say many Canadians are looking at the Australian experience as we have this debate here. This forum has been going on for several years now. There will be another meeting in a couple of years' time in Australia, presumably at this point. What do you hope comes out of these kinds of meetings, the leadership, the business community coming together as they do?
It's been a pleasure to be here at this forum. It last met in Melbourne, in my hometown, in February of 2020, just before COVID. It must have been one of the last large events in Melbourne before we went into what I look back on as a very, very long period of lockdown. And I don't think anyone knew in February 2020 what was coming at us. Yeah. So it's good to be getting back together again. I've seen at this forum a number of the senior business leaders attending, Australian business leaders and Canadian business leaders, renewing the acquaintance that they made in Melbourne in February of 2020, and indeed at past forums, because I think this is the 8th such forum. It's a really useful forum for that engagement to occur between senior business leaders from our countries. We've got a lot in common. I think we can learn from each other, and I think that at this forum I've seen exploring of opportunities that we can do more together.